International Beer Day. I'm down at Camden Brewery in North London with a bona fide legend of the craft beer world, Steve Hindy, founder of Brooklyn Brewery. So on the Craft Beer Channel we're trying to make International Beer Day all about how it all sort of started. So how did you get started in beer?
Well, it's kind of an unusual story. You know, I used to be a journalist. I was a Middle East correspondent for Associated Press. So I lived in Beirut and Cairo. I covered a lot of big stories in the early 80s, like the Iran-Iraq War, the wars in Lebanon. I was sitting behind President Sadat when he was killed in Cairo.
Not many brewers can say that.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Well, when I was in Cairo, I met American diplomats who had been posted in Saudi Arabia, where they have Islamic law, no alcohol. And these guys were avid homebrewers, of necessity.
Because otherwise they couldn't buy it otherwise.
Yeah.
Right.
So I got into making my own beer, and then my wife got fed up with being the wife of a war correspondent, and so we came back to New York. I was making beer at home and got carried away with the whole thing and started a brewery.
So what sort of styles were you making when you were in the Middle East?
Well, they were mostly ales and mostly darker beers. They're actually easier to make than light-colored beers. And I was kind of fascinated by those dark styles too. You know, porter, stout, beers that you couldn't really buy commercially. So it was great to homebrew them.
So is that perhaps why your first beer was Brooklyn Lager, like a darker lager? Is that the thinking?
Yeah, I felt Brooklyn Lager is actually based on the beers that were brewed in Brooklyn back in the heyday of breweries in New York City. You know, 100 years ago there were 45 breweries in Brooklyn, and they were mostly lager breweries, and the beers they were making were quite dark by today's standards. So Brooklyn Lager is based on that tradition of brewing in Brooklyn.
And how many breweries were there when you guys founded by the time you did?
Zero.
So you were the new generation?
Yeah, exactly. The last two big breweries in Brooklyn were Schaefer and Rheingold, and they closed in 1976.
And you opened it in 88?
88, yeah.
And what sort of challenges did you have in opening that?
Oh my God, I mean, people did not know what craft beer was. So, to be honest, many people who tasted Brooklyn Lager back then didn't like it. You know, they said, my God, this beer's so dark and so bitter, why don't you make a beer like Heineken? And I said, well, I don't want to make a beer like Heineken, you know, we're doing something different. But there were enough people who did like it to enable us to get going and build the market. But it was a struggle, it was not easy.
But you said, like, even if the drinkers needed a bit of swaying, like, that there were logistical problems with the mob you got involved?
Oh, distribution was extremely difficult in New York City. You know, the first day we delivered to 5 customers, and basically we just built it up one by one. And yeah, we did have some real adventures in kind of Brooklyn-style adventures, like getting robbed at gunpoint and having to open the safe and turn over all the cash we had. And we had a run-in with mob guys when we were building the brewery, which culminated in a guy putting his hand between my legs, putting his face down next to me and saying, we're going to have to hurt you. And then grabbing me by the shoulders, slamming it against the wall and saying, just kidding. And
you were having
I had to change my pants.
What was their issue?
They, when we built our brewery, we did it with non-union labor. And these were the leaders of the labor movement in Brooklyn. And they were all mobbed up. Actually, the guy I'm talking about went to jail for extortion and racketeering in 2004. So, they left us alone, but it was very scary. They basically threatened us.
So how do you think Brooklyn Brewery came through that and became what sort of top 10 breweries in the US now?
Well, we worked really hard, and we're in a great city, and it's been a great springboard for us to export beer and to sell beer across America as well.
And what are you most proud? What's your favourite beer memory? Sort of looking back on, is it 25 years?
I knew you were going to ask me that question, and my mind went back to when I first moved to New York City in the 70s. We used to go out to Coney Island, and there was a restaurant in Sheepshead Bay called Lundy's, and they had an oyster bar, and you could drink Schaefer beer on tap, the beer that was brewed in Brooklyn, and eat oysters. And it was when I had my first job. I was making enough money to be able to afford to go out and eat oysters and drink beer, and that was such a thrill to go to the beach, spend the day, and then come to the oyster bar and eat those great oysters.
And that beer is part of what influenced Brooklyn.
Yeah, and that's, actually the yeast in Brooklyn is an old Schaefer yeast.
Really?
Yeah.
How did you get hold of that?
It's actually a pretty common lager yeast, or it was at the time. Yeah.
Super. Well, thank you very much for taking the time.
Johnny, my pleasure.
I hope you enjoy International Beer Day and enjoy being in London for the rest of the week.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers, man.
Cheers.